It should come as no shock that a debate raged in Congress for almost 200 years about whether the federal government should provide disaster relief. Although views about the constitutional role of the federal government impeded authorization of early relief efforts, Congress eventually recognized that federal disaster assistance is necessary to alleviate suffering when local governments are overwhelmed. This video will focus on how emergency management came about in the Corps, including the laws by which we are governed, Public Law 8499 and the Stafford Act, and our relationship with FEMA. The comprehensive capabilities of the military and its focus on leadership and readiness make it ideal for disaster relief responses. Indeed, the military has long emphasized these skills in justifying its involvement in disaster relief as preparation for combat. The Corps shares many of these qualities, but it also has inherent civil responsibilities, such as constructing civil works projects and flood fighting. Its expertise in contracting and managing large projects are additional advantages the Corps brings to disaster response and recovery operations. Prior to 1882, the Corps did occasionally assist in local disaster relief authorities as volunteer humanitarian gestures. However, the Corps' ability to respond to an emergency was highlighted during and after the Mississippi flood of 1882. The first official standing order in the Corps to respond to disasters was issued in 1896. Subsequently, Congress first gave the Army authority over how to spend relief funds in 1897. Flooding, the heart of Corps disaster response. The historic, repetitive major flooding on the Mississippi River is what brought about PL 8499 and the Corps' authority to flood fight. The Mississippi River floods of 1912 and 1913 were rated among the most destructive floods in history at that time. Statesman Theodore Roosevelt protested the expenditure of millions of dollars for disaster relief but only pennies for flood protection. He proposed better levees and reservoirs. So in 1913, the Corps got approval from Congress to study various flood control measures. These studies led to the Flood Control Acts of 1917, 1928, and 1936. The Flood Control Act of 1917 was the first to explicitly authorize the Corps to build and repair levees for flood control purposes and the first to provide a significant amount of funding, $45 million, for Corps projects. This authorization was, at least in part, due to a Supreme Court ruling that held the federal government not liable for damages resulting from levee breaches. Basically, the Corps now had legal justification for flood control. The 1928 Flood Control Act embraced a more comprehensive approach to flood control, and the 1936 Flood Control Act first recognized federal responsibility for protecting the population against flood disasters. Over the next few years, many laws were passed that really brought about emergency response in the Corps as we know it today. Hurricane Diane in 1955 resulted in two major laws that greatly affected the Corps mission. The first was Public Law 8471, which authorized a study of hurricanes by the Corps and the U.S. Weather Bureau that led to the Corps construction of hurricane protection works based on a standard project hurricane, defined as the most severe storm that is considered reasonably characteristic of the region. The second was our beloved Public Law 8499, which created what later became the Flood Control and Coastal Emergencies Program. This program authorized the Corps to prepare for floods and make repairs to flood control structures to return them to pre-disaster project conditions. The law provided annual funding which allowed the Corps to create additional emergency management positions. By 1964, most Corps districts had at least a one-person emergency planning office. The FCCE program was expanded by Congress throughout the years to include responses to hurricanes, dam inspections, temporary response to a disaster before a presidential declaration, response to non-flood disasters, using non-structural alternatives, and a levee inspection program. From 1927 to 1947, Congress assigned various executive agencies and departments to oversee relief as a secondary function. By 1950, on more than 120 occasions, Congress had passed laws or resolutions addressing disasters or emergencies, yet there were many disasters to which it had not responded. There had been more than 4,000 U.S. disasters in the previous 29 years alone. Congress recognized that a permanent response capability was necessary and established a continuous means of providing disaster relief. They did this by passing the first Federal Disaster Relief Act, which declared for the first time that it was the responsibility of the federal government to alleviate suffering and damage resulting from major disasters. The Disaster Relief Act of 1950 used the mechanism of a presidential disaster declaration to ensure that a state was truly overwhelmed by the incident before authorizing relief. However, rather than relying on surplus, it provided $5 million in funding. Almost immediately, Congress found this amount insufficient, and within 2 years, it appropriated additional funds. This began the trend of using primarily supplemental appropriations to fund disaster relief. While we won't bore you with the ins and outs of every single Disaster Relief Act that was passed from 1956 to the time of FEMA in 1979, there are a few important things to note. Basically, different presidents had different ideas of how disasters and civil defense should be managed, and the one agency that had federal disaster assistance responsibility changed hands many times. Throughout it all, the Corps of Engineers kept close to each agency and solidified its role as the disaster engineers. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter approved a Bureau of Budget study that resulted in the call for a single agency, FEMA, to manage both civil defense and disasters, primarily as a cost-saving measure. In early 1980, the Corps held its first joint FEMA Corps after-action review to discuss its response to Hurricane Frederick. The Corps noted the gap in time between disasters and disaster declarations and suggested it be given temporary authority after disasters to respond immediately. In response to the establishment of FEMA and the many disasters in which the Corps was involved, then Civil Works Director Major General E.R. Heiberg III directed the establishment of 5-person emergency management offices in all Corps divisions and districts using flood control and coastal emergency funds. This was the first robust disaster relief organization within the Corps of Engineers. A few years later, Congress included gap legislation in the 1986 Water Resources Development Act that authorized the Corps to respond for up to 10 days without a disaster declaration. Finally, after several years of meetings and negotiations, the Corps and FEMA formalized their partnership in a 1988 Memorandum of Agreement. FEMA agreed to expedite notification and to use standardized mission assignments and payments, and the Corps agreed to maintain a cadre of trained emergency managers who knew how to complete the disaster survey reports and other missions. At the same time, FEMA was also deeply involved in developing disaster plans, including the Federal Catastrophic Earthquake Response Plan, which it completed in 1986. A key feature of this plan was the creation of emergency support functions, permanent missions assigned to certain agencies. The Corps was responsible for ESF-3, Public Works and Engineering, which included emergency debris removal, the construction of emergency roads, airfields, and bridges, and demolition, although it supported other ESFs as well. Now, we skipped over a few of the disaster relief acts along the way, but an important one to note was the change that Congress made in 1988. Named for Senator Robert Stafford of Vermont, the 1988 Stafford Act authorized declaration of man-made emergencies for a more limited response. In addition, it authorized new benefits, such as temporary facility replacement, demolition, and debris removal for emergencies, while setting the local cost share at 25% during recovery only. Most important, the Stafford Act vastly increased grants for local agencies, and FEMA's regulations made their award dependent on the completion of training and plans. Chief of Engineers Lieutenant General Henry Hatch established the Readiness Mission Analysis Program in 1990 to review all emergency management programs. The result was Readiness 2000, which launched in April 1998. As originally designed, Readiness 2000 stood on 5 pillars: planning and response teams, threat-based funding, the EngLink database, the Readiness Support Center, and deployable tactical operation systems. Local PRTs were the central feature of the program. The headquarters of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers assigned particular districts or divisions as lead for a specific area, such as removing debris, installing blue roofs, or delivering commodities, and the districts trained and maintained PRTs for these areas. Initially, there were 42 5-person teams for ESF-3. The districts also provided structural engineers to support ESF-9 search and rescue. In addition to the PRTs, HQ USACE also had tasking authority over the 249th Engineer Battalion, Prime Power. The 249th served with distinction during the Cold War and was transitioned to a reserve unit in 1991 until HQ USACE assumed permanent responsibility for the prime power program in 1994. 2001 and the 9/11 attack brought about a shift in the United States to focus more on anti-terrorism. In 2002, Congress created the Department of Homeland Security and placed all anti-terrorism programs under them, shifting FEMA's sole focus to civil domestic disasters. The largest change to core operations on behalf of the DHS came with the creation of the National Response Plan in 2005. Homeland Security Presidential Directive 5 directed the development of a new federal response plan that incorporated the creation of the DHS and its security mission. Perhaps the most positive element of the plan was the adoption of the National Incident Management System, based on the Incident Command System. All personnel supporting FEMA had to undergo NIMS training. Finally, the primary focus of the plan changed from disasters to anti-terrorism. For the most part, core responsibilities under the plan remained the same. However, in addition to its primary responsibility for ESF-3 and support to several other ESFs, the Corps also had an increased role in the new ESF-14, Long-Term Community Recovery, which included building protective structures and mitigation. While DHS was developing the National Readiness System, the Corps was concurrently addressing new readiness requirements and what became known as Readiness for the 21st Century, or Readiness 21. Readiness 21 was the convergence of civilian and military readiness organizations in a single COP. Its primary innovation was the creation of a Director of Contingency Operations, responsible for both civil and military emergency operations. The USACE Operations Center, which combined civilian and military emergency operations centers and organizations, would report to the new DCO. This had the effect of greatly reducing personnel requirements. Under Readiness 21, the Readiness Support Center reported to the DCO, and there were updates to the DTOS and PRTs. In addition, the Forward Engineer Support Teams, teams supporting deployed engineer soldiers worldwide, became permanent modified table of organization and equipment units. Since 2010, billion-dollar and multi-state responses have become commonplace. The Corps has responded with enormous armies of personnel and equipment organized into large task forces led by senior Corps officers. Corps personnel have directly contributed to FEMA's success in developing standards, training, and response plans. The Corps has also defined its partnership with other agencies and with state and local governments under its own authorities through PL 8499. Undoubtedly, disaster relief will remain a vital mission for the Corps for decades to come.